So some strategies for mainstreaming GEDSI within ocean projects. We want to really embed GEDSI considerations across our project cycle. So starting with planning and design, which would also, for ocean, include your application phase. This would be a great time to consider developing a GEDSI commitment, to conduct at least some amount of a GEDSI analysis to be sure that you fully understand the context in which your project is taking place. And you might already have a great understanding of the community that you're working with. And we also recognize that not every organization can do a ton of this work during the application phase. So some of it can also take place during the initial components of implementation. But you will need to understand your project context. So it's probably best if you're able to do some amount of GEDSI analysis, and we'll talk about that in more detail too. You'll be developing your theory of change. It would be also great during this design, or at least very early in implementation, to develop a stakeholder engagement plan, which we'll also talk more about. Ensuring that your project team has the GEDSI expertise needed, and just developing your approach, whether it's GEDSI responsive or GEDSI empowering to meet the requirements. So during implementation, we'll build on all these components from planning and design, and as noted, address any components that you might not have been able to fully do during the design phase, such as a GEDSI analysis. So this is a great opportunity to expand on that and dive deeper into all of the different communities that are involved in your project area. So really looking at who is involved, who might have been left out before, and how they can be included now. Also, identifying and addressing barriers for participation, ensuring equitable benefit sharing, developing, this might be part of your project, it might not, but some skills building, capacity and capability building throughout your project. This is a very important component of empowering communities. So also inclusive and participatory stakeholder engagement. As mentioned, you could develop a stakeholder engagement plan up front, and then during implementation, that's the time to implement the plan. And then really carrying out your GEDSI approach. So monitoring, evaluation, and learning, to incorporate GEDSI into your MEL framework. You can utilize indicators that track components of equality and inclusion. You can also disaggregate data as much as possible, as much data as you are collecting, especially if you're the one developing a survey. You can really set it up so that you're able to disaggregate data. And you can disaggregate by gender or sex, age, disability, indigenous status, etc., depending on the specific context of your project and what information would be most helpful for you to learn from. Also, monitor participation and access to different components of your project, evaluate outcomes for different groups, and ensure inclusive learning. So that means also including the stakeholders in this MEL process. And just to note that MEL is not just at the end of your project. This can take place and should take place throughout project implementation, so that you're really building in opportunities to learn and adapt and maybe change directions a little bit based on what you have learned along the way. Okay, a bit more on a GEDSI analysis. So some questions that are really helpful to be thinking about. What's the context? Who does what? Who has what? Who decides? And who benefits? So to note that in the GEDSI ambition and applicant guidance document, there's a whole text box on GEDSI analysis with a ton of question ideas for each of these categories. And it's not meant to be comprehensive, but just meant to provide some starting points for you all as you're thinking about how to approach this and develop it for your project. So for the context, you would want to look at demographic, legal, social, and economic context. So this could be policies, laws, mandates, commitments, things of that nature, as well as social norms and cultures that are part of the context you're working within. Who does what? So this is where you would be looking at tasks and responsibilities of specific community members or household members, how much time these activities take, where and when they take place. Who has what is looking at the resources and services that people use, access, and control in households, communities, public and private sectors. So it'll depend again on the context of your project, what you'll want to learn more about. Who decides looks at how and to what extent community members of different groups participate in and are allowed to participate in, invited to participate in decision-making within households, communities, public and private sector, as well as your plan for decision-making within your project. Who benefits? So this is looking at opportunities and entry points to ensure equitable participation in and benefits from your ocean project. Ensuring that women and men among different groups, really considering intersectional identities, as well as people with disabilities, Indigenous people in local communities, and others. Who and how are people benefiting from your efforts and from your ocean project? Okay, thinking more about stakeholder engagement. So we'll want to ensure that the stakeholder engagement is inclusive and participatory. So this is called the stakeholder engagement spectrum, and it highlights different types of engagement that you can plan into your project to ensure that your stakeholders and your beneficiaries are being included. So the first is inform, and this is providing stakeholders with balanced and objective information so that they can better understand the project. Consulting is when you're seeking to obtain feedback from stakeholders. So this could be feedback about targets, plans, actions, assessments, or maybe your MEL framework. And then involving is working a bit more directly with stakeholders throughout the project, ensuring that their concerns, their aspirations, their priorities, their challenges, their needs are understood and considered. Collaborate is to work even more closely with stakeholders and including them in different aspects of decision-making throughout the project cycle. And then empower is to place final decision-making or implementation in the hands of stakeholders, creating enabling environments and supporting or incorporating stakeholder-led initiatives. So this might be something that you're looking towards as you're thinking about scaling a project or the future sustainability of a project. And I wanted to note here that each of these components may have their time and place without your throughout your project. So sometimes it's great to have an information session where you're sharing this new initiative. It's often very important to get feedback from community members. So even though there's a spectrum here of kind of the deepness of involvement, they might all be included in your project. In considering the requirements for the GEDSI levels, GEDSI responsive programs would need to have at least some amount of involvement, and GEDSI empowering programs would need at least some amount of collaboration. So something you can keep in mind.